after being insulted by an academic at Melbourne Uni, and it was suggested to me that I was somehow a lesser person because I didn't have this magic bit of paper that this university gave. Instead of getting angry, I took up the challenge. I said, all right, I'll come and get you a little Mickey Mouse bit of paper. It mustn't be too difficult. You all got one.
Gary, when I knew you were coming on the show, I reflected and I realised it's 50 years since we first met, by which time you were, so the early 1970s, you and Uncle Bob Mazza and others were doing Basically Black at Nimrod Theatre in Sydney. And I was so impressed by your fire and your passion and your sense, your justifiable outrage at the status quo. So was school and being expelled, was that the source of your activism?
I mean, when I got kicked out of school, I looked around and thought to myself, I really don't want to be here. And back in those days, you two might remember, in the 1950s and early 1960s, before television, the go was radio. And when you lived in Tenterfield and in some of these little country towns, you had to wait till night time to be able to pick up some of the Sydney radio stations, which is, where I used to love the thinner record spinner on 2UE, a certain John Laws. That's what they called him then, remember he was tall and lanky.
Yeah.
And Tony McLaren on 2UW. I still remember some of these characters. And, so I decided I wanted to go to Sydney, and that's what I did.
Yeah.
And when did the activism start?
Well, as soon as the coppers give me a good kick and to welcome me to Sydney, I mean, it was almost a standard welcoming that young Aboriginal, especially smart-ass young Aboriginal kids like me from the bush, you'd arrive in Sydney, and within the first 2 weeks you would have got your first bashing from the Redfern coppers. I mean, it was police brutality became the issue, the big issue, and 53 years ago, that fired me up and fired up a lot of the other fellow young Aboriginal people like me, most of whom had arrived from various parts of New South Wales. And it was our generation who, decided to take a bit more confrontational approach to some of the problems that confronted us. And the first and foremost problem was police brutality. The 21 Division was sent in against us in Redfern. And the 21 Division is famous for producing such New South Wales luminaries as Roger Rogerson. G'day, Roger. Or Dick Dickerson, as I recall, somebody once played.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Of course. That's a reference to a movie that Gary and I were in called Pandemonium, which, Gary, you'll be pleased to know I saw Hayden Keenan about a year ago on the Central Railway. He was off to a thing. It's become a cult classic.
Well, like a couple of his films, Going Down is another, I mean, I always reckoned that Richard Lowenstein would have knocked off the script of Going Down to produce Dogs in Space.
Yeah.
I knew that what Richard wrote was true because I lived in that house, which is why I'm in the film.
Tell me, Gary, when you used to get clobbered by the Wallopers in those days, did you have to go to court, and were there people like Pat O'Shane around who might have helped you? No?
This is before there were no Aboriginal lawyers at that moment in history. And so we looked to other what we considered similar situations in other parts of the world where people were confronted with the same sort of problems. And we looked at Oakland, California, and we realised there was a group there that was taking some fairly interesting action confronting identical issues of police brutality and police harassment, and that was the Black Panther Party of America. And so we adopted some of their tactics and strategies, which ultimately resulted in us opening the doors of the first ever Aboriginal legal service in Australia in Redfern, which began to then provide some measure of legal protection Still not enough to this day. And the incarceration rates are still as bad as they've ever been. And incarceration rates in a Western society are a good indication of, the economic, social and political status of those who are in prison, By adopting tactics, that was our younger generation's more direct way of dealing with problems that we saw. We thought that the generation that had brought about the 1967 referendum, they were the older conservative generation. We thought that what they were doing was moving too slow, so we wanted to speed things up.
Yeah. At what stage did you get together or meet up with people like Nadia Wheatley and Meredith Bergman and that great anti-apartheid movement which moved the world here that we'll never forget?
I can't remember where I met them two, but I mean, one of the things I did when I moved to Sydney, because I had a broader interest and I was interested in a whole range of things that were happening in the world at that time. I mean, the late 1960s were a really interesting time to be young. There were dramatic changes happening in the world, and if you took notice and you read about and found out for yourself what was happening in other parts of the world, it was really exciting. And, that it was also it wasn't just the birth of the modern day, the radical, average black movement in Australia. There was also, parallel events like the emerging, women's, liberation movement of the time, the gay liberation movement, the anti-Vietnam War, actions that were happening at the time. In 1971, the big Springbok tour of Australia by the Springboks from South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement that grew out of that. So there were a lot of really exciting things happening around us. Yeah. And we were taking notice of that, and we were forming alliances and relationships with, the likes of other young radicals like us, only white radicals like Meredith and, Dennis Streeney and Bobby Pringle and, Joey Owens from the Builders Labourers. And these were exciting times.
Just on those times, I mean, one of my areas of interest is it was around that time that your generation started to adopt the Western art forms that had been imported. So, we suddenly had bands like No Fixed Address and Us Mob. You were part of Basically Black at the Nimrod Theatre. Kevin Gilbert had written Cherry Pickers. What's your reflection now looking back on that acculturation process?
Well, in my case, if anyone looks carefully at the scripts of Basically Black, which was the forerunner of all of them other mob you mentioned, out of that came the first ever all Aboriginal television show. That one episode, they were supposed to make a series, but the ABC got so scared by the stuff we did in the first one, they forgot all about it. But in my case, my appreciation of, I always say to young Aboriginal activists these days, the most important attribute one needs is a healthy sense of the absurd. And I got mine when I used to, 10 years old, late at night, tune in on Sydney radio somewhere and pick up the Goon Show. And I loved Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers and Harry Seacombe and what they did. And they began me on the path of appreciating satire and later on when I became a political activist, I realized that satire and ridicule are some of the best weapons, you got if you got nothing else. If you're really powerless in society, one of the ways of making society sit up and take notice is make them laugh at themselves, And, and so Basically Black, if you compare Basically Black on ABC TV in 1973 and some of the more recent black comedy, I think that's been on Australian black comedy. I think that the current crop just haven't got the same sense of political satire that we had, you know.
For me, it was such a tectonic shift that we finally had the opportunity to hear Indigenous stories being told by Indigenous artists. Not a white fella's version of it, but an actual black fella's version of what life was like. And that was confronting in the best possible way, and it was artistic, and it was, I found it incredibly revealing and powerful.
Mind you, Lex, there continued for some time into the 70s and 80s a propensity on the part of that prominent crop of Australian filmmakers that came out of that new wave, the Noyces and the Peter Weirs and the Fred Skepsis. It seemed to me at the time that every emerging young, promising Australian filmmaker felt the need to be the ones to tell their version of an Aboriginal story. Mm. And almost in every instance, they buggered it up.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So to finally have the process being told from an Indigenous point of view.
Yes, that was important. For the Indigenous voice to get through was really important. And I think that some of the stuff we did with Basically Black and even before us, people like Bindi Williams, who was in Basically Black, he in fact was already a big TV star, as the star, you know, the Aboriginal kid with the giant smile in Woobinda, Animal Doctor. You know, so Bindi was already, and Bindi being the youngest in our crew when we did Basically Black was naturally resentful that some of us older, completely inexperienced people like me, were being, applauded more than he, who was him and Bob Mazza were the only real professionals in the crew.
Yeah, wow. Now, nowadays, several people have sung the praises of your website. Do you want to tell us about your Koori website?
I got taught when I was a young activist, about 17 years old. I got involved at the arse end of the 1967 referendum campaign. And there was a media genius in that, the first Aboriginal professional journalist, a man called John Newfong. You know, I call him the Black Oscar Wilde. He was very much a Oscar Wilde character with an encyclopedic knowledge of media. And he impressed upon me the importance of staying up with the latest in information technology. Back then it was an old Gestetner machine, you know, one of those Rolex machines. Then the next advancement was the electronic, Roneo machine, and then a fax machine, and then all the way through telexes and all this. And I always remembered what Newfong said, and I always made an attempt to keep up with the latest in information technology. And then one day I heard that they'd invented these things called computers, and I thought, I've got to know what these things are and what they do. So I bought an old Amiga or something, I think it was, and I took it to pieces and I put it back together. And then in the earliest days of the internet, before there was an internet, when there was just bulletin boards, I learned how to dial in and download technical manuals from these bulletin boards. And I taught myself computer programming, you know, at the age of about 40 or 50 or something, you know. And so once I'd done that, when I finally went to Melbourne Uni, in addition to studying history, I did one subject in computer science every semester. And as one of my assignments in computer science one day, I created the earliest version of my website. Ah. And then, you know, so many years later, they invent these things called mobile phones. And then I had to go back and download all this other technical info and teach myself how to program mobile phone friendly version. And the current version, GuruWeb, is my mobile phone friendly version.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well done. Congratulations.
And it's important to keep, I reckon it's important as you get older, us of our generation.
Yeah.
It's important to keep an active mind and keep your mind alert. Right. And keep doing things that you're into and that, you know, you're constantly, you know, challenging yourself, you know.
But good on you.
And it's good and it's fun. It can be fun on top of everything.
We have a saying on this program which says, "Get connected and stay connected," and that covers a whole array of things that we can do, but it's all important.
I wish we could keep talking. You're an absolute inspiration. It's been a privilege to have you on the show, mate.
And it's a privilege to meet you too, Patricia.
Yeah, you too, Gary.
I've just got one request from Gary. Gary, would you mind living forever?
I've been trying.
Good on you.
But I don't know how successful I'm going to be from here on in. But I'm going to make a concerted effort.